用声音
碰撞世界，
生动活泼。
欢迎来到 What's Next 科技早知道第8季，和全球创新第一时间同步。Hello， 大家好。那今天是我们的一个 bonus 节目。那上周我回到了硅谷，美国国庆长周末，我也和很多朋友们见面聊天。那发现大家不可避免的还是会聊到前2周刚刚发生的拜登和特朗普的电视辩论的话题。那我关注到的很大的一个变化就是，硅谷科技圈的人士其实一直都是支持民主党的。那今年好像有了蛮大的一个转变，所以今天我们就不聊硬核科技，来聊一聊今年的大选。来聊一聊一些科技大佬他们坚信的哲学，就是客观主义 Objectivism， 然后也聊一聊客观主义背后的提出者安兰德和他的小说。那这一期是一个全英文的节目，嘉宾是安兰德协会 Ayn Rand Institute 之前长期的一个支持者，他对安兰德的作品和他的哲学思想体系也是非常的了解。当然了，他也是硅谷的一个连续的创业者。那这期节目之后，我和节目的小伙伴们会休息几周的时间，来给自己放个暑假。那当然在这个暑假过程当中也不会一直休息，我们会准备几个系列的话题吧，比如像是我们一直想做的 AI 与教育、AI 与芯片等等这样的一个系列话题。那今天的节目大家可以看一下我们的 show note， 找到这次节目我们聊天的脉络。对英文不是特别熟悉的听众朋友们，我觉得最好的一个办法就是把这期节目然后直接扔到各种大模型里面，然后让大模型直接不管是翻译啊还是朗读出来。那我这里就不做更多的翻译了。好的，那在节目开始之前，还想要告诉大家一个特别重要的消息，那就是生动活泼旗下的声音特稿节目《跳进兔子洞》的第3季正式回归了。那这一季节目组做了一件特别有挑战性的尝试。那从去年的12月开始，节目组的2位制作人嘉勋和梦妮花了7个月的时间，制作出了一个涉及众多利益方、卷动着巨大财富、鲜为人知，却跟我们每个人有着千丝万缕关联的故事。那我们把预告片放在节目的最后，那欢迎大家留到最后来收听。The US presidential debate started 2 weeks ago. We have been seeing there's like shift from Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, leaders. They're kind of like very different from what we have seen from the past, maybe a decade-ish. And then Trump even got on All-In podcast, which has Jason Calacanis always has been an opposer to Trump. So I start wondering, like, what has the Silicon Valley philosophies people, entrepreneurs believed in? And then the Ayn Rand popped up, right? Like a lot of people actually like Peter Thiel, and a lot of people said that Steve Jobs, Uber founder Travis, has been advocate for Ayn Rand philosophy, which is objectivism.
I think what you're seeing in Silicon Valley with respect to the election has very little to do with the philosophical shift in Silicon Valley, and quite a lot to do with the change in the Democratic Party, awakening of Silicon Valley to some of the misconceptions that they had about the Democratic Party. So in the past, to many people, the Democrats seemed quite reasonable and a responsible, I'll almost say less religious alternative. Republicans were viewed as the more kind of conservative Christian party, more religious. A lot of Silicon Valley leaders aren't particularly religious. And even the word progressive, it sounds progress. It sounds really good. Many leaders in Silicon Valley, I would say, were probably Democrat by default. Our default culture is democratic values and has been for decades and decades and decades. That's been true. And I say democratic values with a big D. I mean the party. And I think what happened with Biden, I don't think you're seeing people decide that Trump is different than what they thought, although there's some of that. There's some people realizing that he's not as bad as the mainstream media let on. But I think what you're seeing more of is a realization that what we are told about the candidates isn't true from the mainstream media perspective. And Biden, even back in 2016 when he was running, his access to the media was very controlled. I'm sorry, I said 2016, I meant 2020. His access to the media was very controlled. Granted, it was during COVID. You know, they had him broadcasting from his basement and not attending events and that kind of thing. There was a suspicion among some people at the time that part of the reason for that was that He was not 100% cognitively. He wasn't 100% capable. That the people around him were maybe afraid to let him loose in the public. They were afraid that he would come off as suffering from some form of dementia or too elderly or something like that. I think what's happened since then is we've had, for the past several years, there has been a lot of suspicion that he has been in cognitive decline, and the mainstream media, which is where most people get their news, has been covering for him. They've been saying, oh no, everything's fine, he's fine, that's just a lie, that he's in cognitive decline, he's just sharp as ever. You've had major people like Reid Hoffman say, oh, I just had lunch with him last week, he's better than he ever was, right? Which is, it's a lie. Reid Hoffman lied, clearly. So these people say these things about him, and I think they expect to be believed. They expect to be able to propagate this lie and have people believe them. And so they thought that they would get away with it. And I think what happened in the last debate, and actually even leading up to the last debate, it started to become clear to people that actually Biden's not the one in charge.
Nothing like this happened before in U.S. history, or this is something?
Not this bad. I mean, there was, so Reagan had I think it was Alzheimer's. He had cognitive decline in the second half of his second term. Staff kind of covered for him a little bit and managed it, right? And so I'm sure that it's happened before. What hasn't happened is someone running for office in such a horrible state of decline. We're not talking about he has to finish the next few months with some dementia. We're talking about he's asking to run for another 4 years starting from this state, and cognitive decline generally, often can accelerate quite dramatically.
That's pretty much everyone outside of Washington thought.
Right.
You have the power if you're president.
Right. And it turned out you don't. It turns out there's an entire bureaucracy that has way more power than you do, and Trump ran into that. And I think he's still dealing with it. And so in terms of selective prosecution. So that happened, and then so people are looking at Biden and saying, well, we kind of know who's in charge now. It seems like this unelected, faceless bureaucracy is in charge. Not names that we can't name a person in charge. It's all these unelected bureaucrats. I think it started to become clear to people that Biden is the ideal candidate for the bureaucratic state because he does what they tell him to do, right? He doesn't have easily controlled. And so I think people started to get afraid that, wait a minute, these executive agencies, I mean, the executive branch of the government is enormous. It's much bigger than was ever contemplated by the founding fathers. It's an enormous branch with lots of enforcement. And if they're actually in charge, that's scary. And I think that's what people are scared about. You can see it in, for example, getting back to business and tech, you can see it in the M&A space right now. People have been very afraid under the Biden administration to do, they can't. A lot of M&A deals get killed. Both the SEC, the Justice Department, they haven't been very business friendly. And so if you want to do merger, you're likely, like, Linda Khan's going to go after you, probably, right? She's going to say no, just on principle. Lina Khan is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. Her FTC has been quite aggressive in going after mergers and acquisitions. If you want to acquire another company, it's very unlikely that it will get approved. It will probably get challenged by the FTC under her administration. Now, is that because that's what Biden wants? Or is it because that's what the bureaucracy wants? We don't know. It's very hard to tell because we don't know what Biden wants. We're not sure Biden knows what Biden wants. So, once you've lost faith in the idea that there's a strong leader with a vision, it becomes very scary. It's a very scary prospect because suddenly it's people like Lina Khan who are in charge. I think one of the reasons you're seeing people gravitate towards Trump is, as much as some of his personality might not appeal to people, and he's got a lot of bravado, and certainly he comes with a lot of baggage, right? The guy knows what he wants, and he's very straightforward about it. He will fight that bureaucracy if he wants to on issues. And so I think people would rather have some clarity than they would this unelected, unnamed bureaucracy in charge. And frankly, I think if you had a strong Democrat opposing Trump, you wouldn't see so much support for Trump from Silicon Valley. I think you would still see a lot of support for the Democrats. But given the current situation, people are rightfully afraid that the country is being run by a nameless bureaucracy.
this is like a disastrous debate, and then it's like a joke. Like the two elderlies like saying that you suck on stage. It's like disgrace for a country like this. After the first night of the debate, and then it doesn't seem like Democratic Party want to change the candidate. Has been a lot of discussions, and then whether Kamala or maybe even Newsom, governor of California, could be a popular candidate, but it seems like they're still pushing Biden as the candidate for now. Like, what's your take on this?
So first of all, you're right, the debates are a joke, but the fact is the debates have been a joke for quite some time. This was just a particularly obvious example.
It's getting worse, but they still don't want to get another candidate to replace him.
Well, some do. Some have expressed that. The problem is there's a couple problems. First of all, he would have to agree. So Biden has already locked in the delegates necessary to be the Democratic nominee. So the only way the Democrats could run someone else is if Biden said he's stepping out and he hands off the delegates to someone else. Now, Biden will do that if the person he listens to most wants him to, basically. He seems like he's probably, just like any nice old man, he's probably very susceptible to who's whispering in his ear. That seems to be Jill Biden, largely, right?
his wife.
Yeah, so if she wants to be the first lady, he's not going to drop out. If she wants him to drop out, he'll drop out. That's my personal theory about who he's listening to. So a lot of people do want to replace him, but in order for that to happen, he would have to give his delegates back. And that's only going to happen if he does it voluntarily, which means it will only happen if someone with influence convinces him to do it. If you look at the options, let's say he were to do that, Kamala Harris is hated with a passion.
I actually really wonder why that she's so hated.
Well, I think if you see her appearances and like see how she speaks to people, she doesn't come off as very articulate. She sounds kind of dumb, repeats herself a lot, and is condescending. When I talked about before the race to presidency being about how you feel, because that's how the American people vote, she feels bad. She feels unlikable because she's condescending and kind of dumb. So no one really wants. She feels like the bureaucrat at the Department of Motor Vehicles that's causing you a headache for 3 hours because they're incompetent. That's what she feels like. So people don't want that. Now, Gavin Newsom, I don't personally like his policies, but Gavin Newsom is very popular and very likable. I think if Gavin Newsom had been the candidate a year ago, he would have a very, very strong chance in beating Trump.
Definitely, it sounds like they played the wrong card.
Yeah, I think, and it's pretty clear that he is on the short list of future candidates.
Yeah, especially he visited China, I think it was last year, and then she visited in San Francisco too. Mm-hmm. So there has been a lot of kind of publicity for him.
Yeah, and if you look at many presidents throughout history, the charismatic, likable people get elected. Right? Yeah. Gavin Newsom, Bill Clinton, JFK. I mean, these are all people who probably weren't elected because of their policies. They were elected because they were good looking and charismatic, and people like
the feel of it, just like you said.
Yeah. And I think what hurts America more is that the same is true the same plus other problems are true at the level where the primaries happen, because we're basically a two-party system. So many people will just go in and vote for the party candidate. They know they're voting Democrat, they don't care about the name. Or they know they're voting Republican, they don't care about the name. That's been true. Now, Trump has sort of disrupted that, and Trump and Biden have both disrupted that a little bit, because you have a lot of Democrats looking at Biden going, oh my God, I can't vote for that. And you have a lot of people looking at Trump saying, oh, well, he represents things that I don't like, but he's better for these reasons. He's also much more of a populist than past Republicans. He's not a traditional Republican. So in recent times, that's been upset a little bit. But who has won the advertising war for candidacy is the Republicans and the Democrats, because you basically don't vote for anyone else. Very few people vote for any other parties. So if you don't get that nomination, you basically aren't going to be president. And that nomination process is, on the Republican side, it's a little bit more like regular elections. It's kind of transparent, and you see all the people and they get on debate stages and they do their thing. On the Democrats, it seems in recent years there seems to be more backroom dealing and things happening. If you look at Hillary Clinton. She was clearly chosen by the Democratic Party elites as the candidate that was going to run.
I think we should come back to the topic I want to discuss in the first place, like why Silicon Valley has changed, you were mentioning, because the Democratic Party seems like a huge unknown, like a black box, and then people are scared of that. And then especially for Silicon Valley people, they want business, right? And the business first.
Yeah.
And then like this shift is basically based on that. And then I wonder, like, is there any philosophy or theories of Silicon Valley? A name popped up, Ayn Rand, and a lot of like famous entrepreneur has been advocating Ayn Rand's philosophy. And then there are like Ayn Rand Institute, and this kind of like organization has been pretty popular. I know that you yourself has been a donor of such organization before. So can you just tell us a little bit about Ayn Rand, like, and also maybe your personal experience, how you discover Ayn Rand and why it changed you, and then why you kind of advocate for that school of thought?
Sure. There's a lot there as well. But I think at the outset, it's important to point something out. Ayn Rand was a philosopher, although a lot of current academics will dismiss her in the same way that engineering professors would dismiss Michael Dell. But he built a computer company, and he didn't go to college. So like it's that kind of thing, right? She didn't go get a PhD in philosophy, but she was definitely a philosopher. However, her fame came in fiction. She wrote more than 2 fiction books, but 2 very popular fiction books. One was Fountainhead, and one was Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged was her magnum opus. It was her last work. It's very long, and it came out in the 50s. I think it was 1957. I think Atlas Shrugged has sold over 10 million copies at this point, probably. Maybe it's close to 15 now. I don't know. I haven't checked. But Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead were so popular that many people read them and are familiar with their work without necessarily meaning they believe in her philosophy and love her philosophy. For example, in high school, I had to read The Fountainhead. It was an assigned book. Now, no one, including me, understood or agreed with her philosophy when I read that book.
But the school
It was a public school, and she was considered another fiction writer, and she was a fiction writer that was unique. And so just like we might read Orson Scott Card or George Orwell or...
So she's recognized for her literature value.
She was recognized for her fiction, and I don't think the critics loved her, but the population loved her, right? For example, I don't know what critics say about J.K. Rowling, but she's sold a hell of a lot of books, so you have to call her a good fiction writer, right? So it's similar. I don't think Ayn Rand sold as much as Harry Potter, but she was very popular for her fiction. Now, one thing about her fiction is she uses it as a platform to articulate her philosophy. And so sometimes people have aesthetic issues with her work, and they'll say, well, I don't like the way she presented this or executed on this fictionally. But sometimes people have a love of her work aesthetically, and they like maybe parts of the philosophy that she was espousing, but not the whole thing. So I want to separate people who are fans of her fiction work and like it and like some things from people who I would say are Ayn Rand devotees, like devoted to her philosophy.
There's nothing in between, and some people kind of like her work and also inspired by her thought behind it, maybe like kind of be free and then be selfish, like kind of focus on yourself. And some young people who read it probably kind of like in between. What do you think?
Certainly it's not binary, right? And I'm not saying, and actually most people who like her philosophy love her fiction work as well, right? So, but there are people on the whole spectrum. There are people who like the work fiction-wise, but don't like her philosophy at all. And there are people who like her work fiction-wise and love her philosophy. And of course, there's people who just don't like her work generally, right? I guess I should talk about why I know this. So early on in my career, I grew up very Christian. I was in a Christian house and very fundamentalist Christian. And I found Ayn Rand in my early 20s.
It was recommended by a colleague?
It was recommended by a colleague, and I was working at actually a large defense contractor. And it was Atlas Shrugged. Now, Atlas Shrugged is the most philosophy-laden fiction of her fiction. There's lots of philosophy in there. After Atlas Shrugged, when she was done writing fiction, she did write for years and years a lot of nonfiction, explaining ideas or going deeper on ideas. And so I also read a lot of her nonfiction work. And personally, the impact for me was she turned me into an atheist. I can give her credit for that. But I think that the core of her philosophy is that you are responsible for your own judgment. Personally, you can't outsource that. Of course, we outsource to experts, but we use our judgment to decide, is this the right expert and whatever. You're responsible for your own judgment. Only you can think, right? There's no such thing as multiple people thinking together. Like you can collaborate, but you're each an independent mind. So, you're responsible for your own thoughts and actions. And the second component that really stuck with me was the only way to validate whether something is true or not is through the use of reason. Reason is what we call a method of reality correspondence. Does this idea, does this alleged fact, does it correspond with observable reality, right? It's a very simple sounding concept, but it's what makes reason powerful. And it's what makes reason separate from something like faith. Faith is belief in something apart from or contrary to the evidence of reality, right? So if I were religious and I said, well, I believe in God, that's not a reasoned position. And theologists will agree with you. It's not a reason. I mean, some Christians might argue that it's reasoned, but theologists will agree with you. It's not a reasoned thing. It's faith. You have to take it on faith, which means believe it despite or contrary to the evidence of your senses. I think the big religion that is often overlooked today is not Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or any of those. The big religion is statism. This belief that the state knows better. The state, have faith in the state. Have faith in. Democracy is actually a good example. I won't pick on China or any other authoritarian system, but let's just talk about democracy. Democracy is this belief that if a majority of the people want something, it must be the right thing, right? It's the fair thing. It's the just thing if a majority of the people want it. That's not true. In fact, that's often completely false. So there's this faith that people have in the government, in the state, in their community, that what the authorities or what the community or what the people say is somehow true. They'll believe that that's where morals come from. People get confused with the difference between morality and legality. Those are very distinct concepts in Ayn Rand's philosophy. So Objectivism is the name that she gave her philosophy, just to be clear when I say that. I think that one of the major problems, though, with a lot of these movements is, let's be clear, Ayn Rand is dead. She died in 1982. The idea that you should go read what she has to say and try and predict what Ayn Rand would think about some particular issue today is kind of silly. You can guess at what she might think, but the entire point of her philosophy is that it's your job to decide, right? And too many people, including, I'm going to be critical of the Ayn Rand Institute right now, including many people at the Ayn Rand Institute, they have lost sight of the fact that Objectivism is not a religion worshiping Ayn Rand. It's the idea that you are responsible for your own judgment and you should use reason to validate that judgment.
Can we pause a little bit here? Because
Sure.
this is for a lot of people not growing up in the U.S. and in a Christian family, it's kind of hard to kind of make the connection, like why a novel changed someone like you become an atheist. They're just like kind of disconnected there.
Well, I think the important thing is it's the intellectual curiosity and the devotion to reason that does it. So if you grow up in an environment, and most people in the world grow up in an environment something like this, whether it's my religion that I grew up in or not.
Basically just the parents or the society said, because I said so.
You have a lot of unquestioned beliefs, right? Those unquestioned beliefs can be overtly religious. They can be Christian. They can be beliefs about the state. It's right because the government said it's right because blah, blah, blah. Those can be, it's right because there was a great leader that said XYZ at some point. Like those are faith-based directives. They're not necessarily rational. It might be that what was said was rational, but it might not be. One thing that any kind of religion doesn't like is questioning. They don't want you to question. They don't want you to be skeptical.
You already have the seed in you when you're growing up, and then like you were kind of questioning about like whether there's a spaghetti monster in the air.
Well, I think because religion was pushed on me so much, I was very, very concerned with whether it was true. And I believed that it was true for a very long time. But I like to say that I'm an atheist because I took religion seriously. You'll hear a lot of people say things, for example, they will say things like, oh, we should live for the sake of other people, or you should sacrifice yourself for other people, right? If you actually believed that, I'll quote Dr. House, MD right now. If you actually believed that, you would sign your organ donor card and kill yourself. That's what you would do. That's what it means that other people are more important to you than you. If you don't think you're the most important and that you're more important than strangers, if you don't believe that about yourself, if you don't feel that way about yourself, you should sign your organ donor card and kill yourself.
According to House.
According to logic, according to reason. And the fact is, people don't do that. They don't do that because they do care about themselves more than others. They might do that to save their child because they say they care more about their child than they do. And sometimes they do that for causes, right? This is why men get inspired to go to war for various causes. They're willing to sacrifice themselves for some cause. But the point of Ayn Rand is really, you're responsible for your own judgment. And for me, the skepticism was because I took religion seriously. And because I took it seriously, she made arguments that were moral arguments, that were rational moral arguments. And they're not compatible with some of the Christian beliefs. Some of them are, right? They both believe in not murdering, for example. And I had to, at some point, I felt like I had to make a choice. Am I willing to say, well, I'm not going to use reason in these cases, and I'm going to use reason in these other cases? Or is reason the way that I'm going to vet all of my ideas? Am I going to subject myself? You can almost think of it as like making yourself a slave. Am I going to be a slave to truth and reality? Like, am I going to subject my ideas and my thoughts to what my judgment says reason dictates? And if I see a contradiction, am I going to try and correct it in myself, or am I going to deny it and ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist? And most people choose the latter. They deny it, they ignore it, it's uncomfortable, it makes them feel icky inside, so they go home and have a drink. They don't want to confront the fact that many of their ideas do not play out properly in reality. They don't work in reality. And so that's my journey. That's why I'm here, and I know I've read all of her nonfiction. I know Ayn Rand's philosophy very well. I think it's not very popular. Let's put it that way. It's not a very popular philosophy. Most of the world operates on some form of faith because you can't control people without faith. If you tell everyone to use your own judgment, they might not follow you. And that's a problem for most leaders.
But do you think if you followed her thought and then eventually you are kind of emerge into a leader, like we just talk about like a lot of Silicon Valley, like unique minds, and they're just like one of a kind in their own field. And then do you think that's kind of like somewhat self-selected? Like, for example, like Elon Musk is like always think through first principle. And then this is kind of similar in a sense. Like you don't follow other people's thoughts and you don't kind of like just treat everything as granted.
Yeah, I think there's bound to be statistical overlap. And the reason for that is, it's not a one-to-one correlation, obviously, but the reason that there's some statistical overlap is in order to be a successful entrepreneur, usually you have to be pretty reality-focused. Usually, at least when it comes to your business. Maybe you're not reality-focused when it comes to morals or who you vote for or other things like that. But when it comes to running your business, if you look at your sales numbers and they're declining, you can't just say, well, I feel that they're good, let's go pray. That doesn't work. You will go out of business, right? So you have to deal with situations. You have to deal with what's in front of you. You have to measure reality. You have to be courageous enough to look at the ugly things in your business and try and work on them. And that intellectual curiosity and dedication to looking at reality is very similar to the objectivist mindset. So you will likely have a large overlap between successful entrepreneurs and many objectivist ideas. It doesn't mean that anyone who says they're an objectivist will be successful, and it certainly doesn't mean anyone who's successful is necessarily embracing objectivist ideas. So on average, over time, the business leaders who accept reality and confront reality win, and the ones who don't. And that's on average. It's over time. It doesn't mean you can't find counterexamples. Of course you can.
That made me thought of the characters in Aaron's book, like Hank, like Francisco, Hank Reardon. They're all like entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I think one thing about Ayn Rand is she worshipped, I'm using that term intentionally, she worshipped business. She thought businessmen were great. She thought entrepreneurs were awesome.
Which is really unlike the culture right now.
Yes. And the reason she thought this, there's two reasons. One is, remember that she's imagining, when she thinks of an entrepreneur, she's thinking of an entrepreneur in the free market. As soon as you have something like the United States where you have a mixed economy, you have a lot of success based on qualities that would not be in an Ayn Rand hero. Who you know, who you can bribe, what kind of politics you have, like that kind of stuff, right? That's not the kind of entrepreneurship she embraced and loved. She embraced and loved the entrepreneurship of Hank Rearden, who worked in the coal mine, saved up money to buy a little piece and then built that up more and more, and then, invented a new metal. And it wasn't about who he knew, what his network was, how his marketing was. It was about building something real, right? That he built. And she really had a lot of respect for that. And I think it makes sense that she had a lot of respect for that, because at the end of the day, what raises the standard of living isn't governments, it's invention and productivity. That's how standards of living get raised. The reason that you and I are having this conversation in a house with equipment that would put the richest kings of 100 years ago, it will put them to shame. They will be in awe of how we live. And the reason for that isn't some central planning economic strategy. It's not some, the right political leader, blah, blah, blah. It's not any of that. It's that individuals worked their butts off to invent and build new things, that's what productivity is. And when it's done well and it's done right, they employ other people. And you end up with the sum being worth more than all the parts. You end up with a win-win scenario, right? That's what builds wealth. That's what builds a raised standard of living. And that's what she worshipped. And she recognized the value of entrepreneurs and their minds, the prerequisites for having that politically, which is freedom, right? That's what she recognized.
Right. That made me thought about, you were just saying U.S. is living borrowed time, and then Silicon Valley, the whole technology advancement is driving us moving forward and then creating more values. That seems probably the only driving force.
Yes.
Nowadays. And then I don't know, if we compare it to the plots in the books, it's like there might be a train wreck somewhere, sometime down the road.
Well, look at the United States economically. I don't remember how many, are we at $20 trillion in debt? Maybe more, I don't remember. Something ridiculous right now. Our debt is increasing in just a massive, massive way. We're completely insolvent. The truth is we're actually insolvent. Just the rest of the world doesn't. They're willing to give us some more rope to hang ourselves with, right? They're not trying to cash in. But the only thing, we can talk about inflation, which has been a big issue in the US for the past few years, right? The Fed has been battling with inflation. Well, inflation happens, obviously, when you print money. That's what happens. You print money, the money becomes worth less. Therefore, prices go up. That's what causes price inflation predominantly. So we can say, okay, how long is that sustainable? How long can you keep doing that? And I think what Ayn Rand got wrong was she didn't count on entrepreneurs being as productive as they are, which is kind of funny, because she thought they were the only most productive force. They were the best productive force. She loved them. She still underestimated them, because what entrepreneurs have done and what business has done is it has kept the government going longer and longer and longer. The government can print trillions of dollars, and productivity increases fast enough that it doesn't destroy the economy. That's how the United States has been operating for a while. Now, people are worried that it's going to catch up. I thought it was going to catch up with us 10 years ago. I was wrong. Now with AI, I'm not sure when it's going to catch up with us, because we're going to be so much more productive.
We were just talking about nuclear fission energies. So if that happens in the next maybe 10, 20 years, so the train wreck day may not happen.
Yeah, I think it's weird. You can view, from a free market perspective, you can view the government and regulation as this leech, this kind of parasite that's sucking the blood out of the host. And you think eventually you can't keep sucking blood. Eventually the host will die. But if the host is growing exponentially, The parasite just keeps growing.
We have so much bacteria or like virus on our skin, we probably just never noticed them because we're too strong.
Yeah. And so I do think eventually it needs to catch up with us. So this is a mistake I think that a lot of objectivists make, and a lot of people that think about this philosophy make. In the long run, reason wins. In the long run, spending money you don't have is not sustainable. In the long run, the free markets work out. The question is, what does the long run mean? Is it a million years? Like, okay, in the long run, reason wins. In the long run, that's true. I mean, this AI thing is perfectly timed, right? If you think about it, the US, without AI, the US is about to be really, really hurting in the next decade. Really hurting. And now there's this lifeline that's, oh, maybe we can be 100 times more productive than we were. Okay.
I think that, I'm not an economist. The whole reason that we're not in the Great Recession again is because the AI is pretty much driving all the stock market. The Magnificent Seven, I think there's Tesla drop out of it. Now it's like 6. What's the 6 name again?
They call Super 6 or something.
Super 6.
Remember. And the truth is, productivity has risen dramatically, and that has saved us. If the government can print money and tax and hurt business and hurt people, let's say that their impact on you is to reduce your wealth by 10% every year. If technology increases your wealth by 15% every year, you don't care. You don't notice it. You're growing slower than you would have, but you have nothing to compare it to. That's what allows this to keep going. So it's very likely that this will keep going in its current form for quite some time because AI has a significant amount of promise.
So Ayn Rand's philosophy, a lot of people say that she's like derivative from Nietzsche and some part of it. And some part of it, she's like also like strong advocate for Friedrich Hayek. Can you tell us more about like those areas?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not just saying this because I like Ayn Rand. I would say this about other philosophers who I think get treated the way she does. But every philosopher is somewhat derivative. Kant ripped off Plato. You can look back at the Greek philosophers. You can then actually look at some Eastern philosophers and see that they said some things that are similar. So first of all, sometimes you have two different people coming up with the same ideas, but often you have people building on other people's ideas. And so Rand never claimed, for example, she used the phrase A is A all the time, which is her metaphysical statement. A thing is what it is. A is A. That came from Aristotle. She didn't pretend to make that up. She said it came from Aristotle very clearly. She didn't pretend to make up all of her philosophy. What she did was take what she felt were the good ideas from the previous philosophers and synthesize them into one system. I think there's a lot of value in that. I think she also contributed some things of her own, but philosophy is a rather complex subject. So to say, oh, it's all derivative work, you just haven't read it. I mean, that's just a statement out of ignorance.
You were saying there's a system.
Yes.
That her work is more like a system comparing to other philosophers. So what do you mean by this system?
Well, you used this idea of first principles earlier. Rand similarly built off of first principles. And when I say a system, she said, okay, here's Aristotle's metaphysics. This is why it's important. Here's the epistemology to support it. Here's the ethics that come out of that, right? And they're all related, and they're all self-consistent. There's no contradiction. Rand's ethics and politics, and I would argue she was wrong on some aesthetics, but whatever. Those things don't have internal contradictions. A lot of philosophers have. I actually think a lot of philosophers aren't actually philosophers at all. A lot of philosophers just say sound bites, and then they'll say something else that's completely contradictory to their previous sound bites. They basically write fortune cookies. They put them in collections of books, and they have lots of phrases that are kind of catchy and cool or interesting ideas. They don't mesh with one another, right? And so one of her values is that they mesh and that they are life-affirming. So you can have systems that mesh. Nietzsche is an example of, I would say, any system. You should also evaluate a system not just internally, but whether it corresponds to reality. So I think Nietzsche failed on some reality correspondence, but he was largely self-consistent. But of course, the conclusions were nihilism, right? Like, it becomes a completely useless philosophy. And I think what Rand saw, I don't know if she saw this explicitly, but at least I see it in her philosophy, years after her death, is, you had religion. Religion was a way for morals to be transmitted to people, at least in the West, right? You go to church and they give you 10 commandments, and you end up with a society of people who know not to steal or murder each other or whatever. They're very clear rules. It's religion. So a lot of what Ayn Rand was fighting against was she saw America in its essence. She saw what she felt made America special in its, not make America great. You wanted me to say a Trump thing. We'll do a Trump thing. She saw what made America great, right? And she wanted to make America great again. She saw what the ideas that founded America, how they were separate and unique from other countries. She thought it was special. And she saw that the culture and the philosophy that had become part of American culture was an enemy of the very ideas that made America successful. And so the reason she's hated is because she attacks mainstream in a major way. She attacks mainstream institutions. Mainstream philosophy was her target. And that made her extremely controversial. People hated her.
I mean, even in nowadays, I've listened to a podcast made by a Chinese philosopher who I think she's studying in the US. She's kind of from institution like philosophy, that domain and realm, and she introduced the book. And basically her description of the book is the book from its literature value is super low because it's more like Rand from herself, and the character is not complicated, and basically it's the good people is just excellent, bad people are just worse. Bad people are bureaucrats and scholars, and basically they don't invent anything, they don't do any productivity things. So basically that's her criticism about Rand.
Yeah, I mean, Rand was very clear about this, and I actually like it, and a lot of people do like this. We live in an age where people want everything to be morally fuzzy. If you have a hero now in a movie, he's got to have a drinking problem or a drug problem or some other problem.
Somewhat relatable. Right.
And the idea behind that is, well, it's unrealistic. No one's perfect, right? It's a very cynical attitude to have, and is born from self-hatred. I don't like this character. This hero is too heroic. He should have a problem, a major flaw, right? That's an issue. But Rand intentionally distilled her characters to their essence. So did Dagny Taggart sometimes have diarrhea? I'm sure she did, but it wasn't part of the book because it's not relevant to who she is. It doesn't matter. Did she make mistakes? Yes. Did Hitler love his mom? Maybe. Actually, I don't think he did. But, was he a good artist? I don't know, maybe. But that's not the essence of Hitler. He was an evil person, so we don't need to talk about his good qualities. I think we live in a culture right now where people don't like to see heroes. And one of the reasons for that is they don't like moral standards. So Rand was presenting a moral standard. This is the standard. The heroes like Francisco d'Anconia, like Hank Rearden, they're the standard. Can we live that way? No, none of us are going to actually achieve that standard. It's a black and white. This is a presentation of the essence of her ideas. And so she wrote characters that encapsulated the values that she believed in. And she wrote characters that encapsulated the values that she felt were destroying America. Those were the characters. And I think if that's your critique of the book, it's a little bit sophomoric because you're not taking the book for what it is. She wasn't trying to write a Quentin Tarantino film. Actually, you know what's a great example of this? Superheroes, and not the modern superheroes, but a lot of superhero lore, right? And a lot of, fans of superheroes. I'm not really a huge fan of superheroes, but a lot of people are. They like that this villain is a villain and the good guy is a good guy. That's what attracts people to it. I think most people try and tear her down because they don't like her philosophy, so they try and tear down. The Bay Area, Silicon Valley in particular, is very religious. The religion isn't Christianity, it's radical leftism. So,
but we have seen that this change a little bit. I mean, at least you can talk about it more than ever, and especially we all listen to All-In podcast a lot, and then they got Trump.
Well, let's be clear about the All-In podcast. They invited Biden. And Chamath, who's one of the 4 members of the Elon podcast, he donated a lot of money to Biden in the first campaign and asked Biden to come on the podcast. Biden's people declined for obvious reasons. So they have invited all the presidential candidates on their podcast. Biden is the only major one that didn't show up. Trump did. So that's why Trump was on the podcast. And like I said, I think in Silicon Valley, I think what you're seeing, I don't think there's a lot of overt advocates for objectivism or Ayn Rand in Silicon Valley, but I think there's an overlap between the personality that would like some things about Ayn Rand's work and the personality that would be a successful entrepreneur.
Right. Like, for example, Elon Musk is not Ayn Rand's objectivist, but he's actually, you can see his changing from what he believes in the past, and now he's owns Twitter, and then a lot of people hate him because what he believes now.
That's an example that demonstrates the religion I was talking about in Silicon Valley, which is, you're in a religious environment when you have heretics. People attack each other for not just for supporting the wrong candidate or the wrong ideas, but being friends with someone who supports the wrong candidate or the wrong ideas. So
the cancel culture still exists.
It does. And I think to some extent, I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon.
But it's getting much better.
But it is better. Yes.
Yeah.
It is much better. But I think one of the reasons it's much better is the narrative around Biden has unraveled. What that means, there's something bigger than Biden. What happens is the media has lost credibility. These people have lost credibility. They've been saying things, radical things, ever since 2016 when Trump got elected. There's been a lot of radical statements and radical things being said by the mainstream media. Trump is a Nazi, this and that. Biden is perfect, blah, blah, blah.
He's a felon, and then I read into it, and he's like, his crimes is so petty.
Right. And that's why David Sachs calls this lawfare. So just to be clear for people who aren't in the United States, I don't remember exactly this statistic, but it's something like this. It's going to blow your mind. Be ready. The average American commits something like 6 felonies a day.
What?
Yes. There are so many federal laws on the books. Yeah. So my point is anyone who's been successful either in business or as a politician probably has committed some felonies. They've probably broken some laws because the laws are so voluminous and so there's so much minutia and stupid details and things can get blown into felonies that are like forgetting to file something that anyone could be prosecuted. Now, the reason the system still works is because people don't prosecute each other. People don't go after that. Because if they did, everyone would be in court all the time. The problem is, if you get someone who comes along who is hated universally, like Trump, they have a whole litany of things that they can go after him for. If they want to prosecute you, they will find something and probably convict you, as they did Trump. The media and the mainstream have lost 100% of their credibility. People just don't believe them anymore. They've been in charge, and the American people, including in Silicon Valley, are starting to look at this and say, wait a minute, there's this huge bureaucracy. They're not just inconvenient. They're actually trying to seize power by getting Joe Biden elected. Joe Biden is their candidate, and that scares the heck out of people.
And especially Silicon Valley people,
Well, they want clarity. Any business person, I mean, you can see this, you can watch the markets prior to elections. Business people want clarity. They prefer less regulation, if they can get that, of course. Less regulation, less business. They prefer all that stuff. But most importantly, they need clarity. Biden does not represent clarity. It's massive uncertainty because he's not in charge.
Do you think this is no way back?
Well, a lot of people think there's going to be a switch. I know Jason Calacanis he tried to bet David Sachs that there would be a switch.
Yeah, but David said
Sachs backed out. Sachs.
I haven't listened to Riz.
Sachs, he needed to man up there. I would have bet Jason. Jason, I think, is wrong. There will not be a switch. Biden will be the candidate. I don't know who's going to win, but Biden will be the candidate. I don't think there's going to be a switch at all. I could be wrong, of course.
So far, you're still right.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Any last thoughts on this?
I would encourage people to read The Fountainhead first.
Then Alex Shrugged.
The Fountainhead is not as philosophical. It's just a good story about architecture. I know a lot of architects who really like The Fountainhead and don't really like Ayn Rand at all. So read The Fountainhead. It's a good book. And if you like the style, then go ahead and read Atlas Shrugged and just be aware that what you're getting into when you read it, it's a long book and it's going to be heavy on philosophy. But The point isn't to, when you read something that's controversial and outside of the mainstream, have an open mind. Approach it as instead of trying to debunk everything, read it all first with an open mind. Really consider the arguments, really think about it, and then afterwards you can be critical of it. So I would suggest, I think it's something that everyone should read, frankly, because I think one thing that makes Ayn Rand unique is she did actually understand the essence of the United States. She did understand what made the U.S. different. And most people don't.
Innovation and productivity.
I think she would say individualism. Very few people understood that. I mean, we had Frederick Douglass, the famous anti-slaver. He understood at some point in his career when he was lecturing, he understood about how the U.S. how slavery, for example, was a contradiction compared to the U.S. ideas, and he supported the ideas of the U.S. originally and said, his criticism of the government was it wasn't living up to its own ideas, and he was correct about that. So there have been a few people who kind of get it, but Rand got it, and she articulated it really well, and whether you like the United States or not, understanding the essence of it, if you understand the essence of it half as much as Ayn Rand did, you'll understand it 100 times more than the average American, because they just don't understand it at all. So I would read the books.
All right. That's great parting thought.
It's been the sexiest host I've ever had an interview with.
All right. Thank you. 这就是我们今天的 What's Next 科技早知道。欢迎大家在评论区和我们留言互动，加入到科技和创新的下一步讨论中来。另外，如果你想支持我们在播客内容上的探索和创新，欢迎大家加入我们的生动胡同会员计划。详细的加入方式和信息，请查看本期节目的 show note。那我们下期再见。
那天我是在家里刚起床一会儿，就是圈子里的一个朋友，还有我的一个师叔，然后就给我发信息，然后就问你们团队的壮壮咋回事啊？
壮壮大名呢叫做赵一楠，本来这一切都曾是关于他的一场意外。
女子形体全场冠军的健身网红壮壮在健身房突然去世，
说什么都有啊，说什么的都有。
不过这仅仅是一颗洋葱的表皮。
其实这个圈子里的这方面的事儿很多。
你说去世的很多？
对，
有得白血病的，得癌症的，有猝死的。
在一层一层剥开壮壮短暂的23年人生之后，我们发现了故事的另外一个主角，他叫做
科技。
这实际上是一种药物，它能让你在短时间里变成所谓的超人。
相当于本身这个肌肉原先是一根手指，用了之后呢，一根手指里头呢可能变成了2根骨头。
当时给我的感觉就是哇，这个东西好神奇。
每天都有成千上万的人把这种药灌注到一个一次性的注射针管里，然后将一根长达3.5厘米的针头扎进自己的大臂、大腿和屁股。害怕？
当时心情是比较害怕的。
他们说扎血管里就死，更害怕了。
我自己是不敢扎的。
其实我第一次扎完我就想着我会不会死啊。
这种药物本身并没有成瘾性，但却能让他们一针接着一针停不下来。
对，因为让我说的你只有一针跟无数针。
这点疼痛不算什么的，只要能变大，再疼一点无所谓的。
当你身体出状况的时候已经晚了，这人基本上已经无法挽回了。
从一个年轻女孩的意外，到一类被美名为科技的药物，再到一群用药上瘾的人，是什么将他们联系在了一起？
很多人也不理解，其实我自己也不理解，但是我就想站在那个舞台。
你只要来，我就保证你能拿到第一名。
所谓的灰色地带就是这个东西其实你难查。
健身肌肉非常大的一个产业，他得用它挣钱，
因为这个东西是暴利。
有多暴利？这能说吗？
几十倍吧。你关了我再跟你讲。
行，关了你再跟我讲。从7月9号开始，跳进兔子洞第3季将为你讲述一桩未解的意外死亡，一门建立在人性弱点上的生意，和我们所有人都追求的关于美的另外一张面孔。